Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Understanding Environmental Baseline Schedules training. My name is Amber Maddox. I am the Environmental Delivery Support Team Manager, and I'm just going to jump into a few housekeeping items and a quick overview before we hear from our presenters for today. So number one, anonymous attendees will not show up in the chat box. I'm sorry, on the engagement report. That means you should have the option to sign in as anonymous or with your name. If you choose to sign in anonymous, you won't show up on the engagement report for purposes such as attendance or things like that. Also, microphones are muted, so you won't have the opportunity to speak out loud. We won't be able to hear you. Let's see here. Questions are going to be taken via the chat box. Like I said before, microphones are muted, so you'll have to type your questions into the chat box. Again, if you sign in with your name will appear with your question. If you choose to sign in anonymous, then we won't see your name beside your question. Questions will be taken and addressed officially the last 30 minutes of the training session. However, that doesn't mean you need to wait to type in your questions. You can type them in at any point throughout the training as they come up. This session is being recorded, and at some point after this training, the session will be made available as needed. Also, for those needing CEU and PDH credits, there will be 2 available for folks attending this entire session. And if you need a certificate of completion for this training session, you'll want to email Gail Davino. Her email address is listed here, and make sure that you include your name as you want it to appear on the certificate, as well as your employer. So just to give a brief rundown of the presenters that we will hear from today. First, we'll hear from Eric. He'll talk a little bit about environmental perspective. Amber will come up and speak about initial environmental schedules. Gail will speak about environmental schedules in the PDP. Then Amber will come back to talk about setting workload priorities. Then you'll hear from me. I'll be speaking on recovery schedules. Jim will then come and speak on it when the schedule goes off track. Doug will speak briefly on the shelf, and then Gail will do a quick wrap up and key takeaways, and we will address comments at the end, and that will be moderated by Sandy Lawrence. So at this time, we'll hear from our first presenter, Eric, who will be speaking on environmental perspective.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Eric Duff. I am the State Environmental Administrator here at Georgia Department of Transportation. This training is all about the staff have a better understanding of how schedules fit into the PDP and how staff can better understand the process. As everyone knows, GDOT is responsible for planning, constructing, maintaining, and improving the state's roads, bridges, and interstate highways. But each project, each schedule is a promise to a stakeholder, a promise to the public that we are going to improve the quality of their life, make our roadways safer, or better put, we are fulfilling our job and fulfilling our mission. Office goals, and we talk a lot about performance metrics. Performance metrics are critical to our success. They help us align our work to the promises we have made to the public to deliver projects on schedule. Performance metrics also help us understand the deficiencies in the process and how we need to improve project delivery as a team, how we work with our internal customers so that OES and other internal customers aren't being asked to recover schedules so often. And on this slide, you see the Office of Environmental Services, our performance metrics, as well as our section metrics per baseline schedules. All projects start at the same place, on time. It's what happens in between when a project goes live and then when we actually go to construction. What happens in between, and there are a lot of risks that happen in between. And on this slide, you see just a number of them. One risk that you don't see is late notice to proceed. That often affects our delivery as well. It's really about how we mitigate those items that determines if we can make a schedule or not, and how we communicate with one another to make sure that a schedule that gets off track gets corrected with a recovery schedule. So for OES, we use a number of items to make sure that we achieve our office goals. Innovation and collaboration, very important to the department. We really work hard to strengthen the relationship with our consultant partners. Communication, always a key. Accurate updates and reporting. And then once we make a commitment, it's that we maintain and make sure that commitment gets done. So in this training, we're going to provide the tools and education on how to manage heavy workloads and how to work together as a team with our internal partners to ensure we are doing everything in our power to maintain project schedules. So you're going to learn a lot about baseline schedules today, funding years, what the shelf means, when we actually continue to work on a permit, when a 404 permit, when a project is on the shelves, and when we don't. And then ultimately, we're going to talk about what we do when we have unachievable schedules. Communication obviously is important. We have a number of key team meetings that we attend. That is important that we convey correct information. And then ultimately, if we do have to shift fiscal years, how do we do that as well? So with that, I am going to turn it over to Amber Phillips.
All right, I'm going to go over how we actually get an initial schedule on a project. So just briefly, the steps are there is a PTIP meeting or project team initiation process meeting, and that's actually done on our capital program and our bridge program. From there, the PM will request an initial schedule template from our Office of Program Control. They will provide the schedule template, Program Control does, and sends it out for comment and concurrence. They send it to the PM, and the PM actually sends it out. Once schedule receives concurrence, it goes to the schedule review for approval. Once it's approved, the Office of Program Control sends an approval email to our OES schedulers, and our schedulers will alert OES staff and ask for the projects to be assigned. So if for some reason a project needs to be assigned before that point, then you have to reach out to the Office of Environmental Services. So what's discussed at a PTIP meeting to help determine the schedule? OPD has a government estimator, and they perform desktop studies. They'll look at potential environmental hurdles and what activities need to be included in the schedule to help put the best schedule on a project that we can. Of course, we don't know everything by doing a screening, but we attempt to put a project schedule on the project that will work. Later in this presentation, we'll talk about PCRFs and when those are used. So as you can see on the right of my screen, this is just an example of what is shown and what might be discussed at a PTIP meeting. And after that meeting, the PM will fill out and submit the initial schedule request form, and that's on the right of my screen. It'll type out what different activities might be required. So if we think we might have 4F, they'll put that in the conditions so that Office of Program Control knows what needs to be included. So all those things, do we need a PAR? What type of project? Are there any other risk factors that they need to know about to extend any timelines? All that will go on that form for Program Control to put an initial schedule on for review. So the different schedule templates that Program Control uses, they'll use an EA schedule template. And then of course I mentioned, does it have 4F? Does it not have 4F? They'll have a CE template similar to the different options with 4F or not, the state funded template. And then we also have some minor templates for projects that are not as difficult. And if those go on them, then they will reduce some timeline activities. So in general, we have 120 days for resource ID and 120 days for our effects evaluations. But on minor projects, that time may be reduced to 40 days for resource ID and 40 days for AOEs or templates with or without concept reports. For in-house staff, program control does have a Teams page that can be visited if you're ever interested in looking at those templates. Schedule approval process. Currently, myself, the assistant office head in environmental, will approve it for environmental to go to schedule committee. After all offices concur on the schedule, it's submitted back to Office of Program Control for the schedule committee. And then the schedule committee will either approve or reject that schedule. And after approval, then it's sent out for notification that the schedule is active. It's sent out after NTP now, so it won't go live until NTP occurs, and the schedules will notify staff once the project is actually live. If NTP is delayed, the schedule is typically modified via schedule modification form. OPC notifies when schedule goes live in P6, and our schedulers will notify our staff. And with that, I'll hand it over to Gail Davino.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm glad you could all join us. I'm going to be talking about our milestones and activities that Eric and Amber have mentioned, and specifically putting it in the context of the plan development process. So as everyone knows, we've been in this business for a while. We're all dependent on each other when we develop a project. And if any one of us has a slowdown, that can cascade throughout project development. A lot of things run concurrently, but others are dependent on that handoff from another team member. So this morning, I'm going to focus on these interdependencies and these leading indicators. Late starts, late finishes all have downstream implications. And that's true whether it's due to the late receipt of the deliverable you need to get started, or whether or not you simply finish after your scheduled completion date. Many of you should be familiar with Appendix O in the PDP manual. Sam Woods and our roadway design group developed this appendix, and it exhibits how design and environmental activities progress in tandem. This process flow maps out the multiple activities required to comply with the many environmental laws and regulations that we're tasked with working with and how they relate to PDP milestones. I'm sure that you can't read all of the details, but I do want to point out that we identify resources, environmental resources during concept. This allows the team, especially design and environmental, to work together to avoid and minimize impacts. Plans developed coming out of A3M are used to analyze impacts and consult with agencies during our technical studies. This allows us, the project, to advance to the preliminary field plan review. If it is federally funded, a NEPA document follows. And of course, all of this is needed to authorize right-of-way funds. But we continue during final design. While right-of-way is being acquired, FFPR takes place, and this is where we apply for permit and variances during final design, but we also need to update studies and a reevaluation if it's federally funded, and permits are all needed prior to us being able to let the project. Well, moving to take a closer look at Appendix O and concept phase. Environmental gets underway once we receive the environmental survey boundary, and our goal is to transmit resource boundaries to the design team. 4 disciplines are tasked with identifying resources. As Amber indicated, generally 6 months are allowed to complete this effort, and everyone needs to be underway at the same time. And I want to note that resources are identified whether or not the project is state or federally funded. Well, many steps are needed to get environmental resources undertaken. And it's really important that they occur sequentially, and so that we hit the ground with background research, early coordination, field work, and all of that allows preparation of the survey report. That survey report can then be put in review, and if it is being prepared by consultant partners, coming over to environmental services for quality assurance review, and if the discipline requires it, sending it to an agency review and their concurrence in the last couple of months. And this, of course, allows us to get delineations to design. Well, when we look at this on the process flow, this is just another way of looking at this 6-month timeline. And so our leading indicator is receipt of the environmental survey boundary with the goal of completing our resource identification. Well, what happens when that resource, that ESP arrives 2 or 3 months late and the report comes to environmental services late? Well, that is going to delay our A3M, which is a critical part of getting our technical studies underway. Resource identification efforts may reveal issues that require additional time that weren't anticipated. As Amber indicated, we do make every effort to anticipate these things, but it doesn't always happen. And so, as Eric has indicated, communicating any schedule implications to the team, the PM, the environmental analyst is vital. And if it's a consultant team delivering the product, we need to be mindful of contract scope and being in communication with the PM about any implications to the contract scope. Well, as we move through the next couple of phases, I'm going to use the term hot button changes several times. And so I just wanted to throw this slide up there as a quick reminder as to what types of changes are hot buttons for the environmental process. And they're hot buttons because they often result in the need to update studies and even possibly requiring additional field work. And so looking back at Appendix O and preliminary design activities, once A3M occurs, environmental technical studies, including agency consultations, get underway with receipt of that plan set resulting from the A3M discussions. Our goal is to complete these studies prior to the preliminary field plan review. 6 disciplines are tasked with conducting technical studies and agency consultations. And for a long time, it had been 6 months, but we have coaxed program control into giving us a little extra time, taking us right up to PFPR. And these studies are the same generally for state or federally funded projects, though I will say that air and noise will differ a little bit depending upon our funding source. And I do want to just quickly say that to fully evaluate impacts on bridges over waterways, our agencies do like us to consider bent placement and construction access. Will we need a temporary work bridge or a rock jetty? And we're working hard to develop a way to consider these factors without knowing specific details because we are in preliminary design at this point. And so we're looking at different ways to do this, and we're working with folks in roadway and design to flesh out some guidance. If you are going to be at the summit next week, you'll hear more about this effort. So again, as with resource identification, this activity requires steps that are undertaken sequentially. Plans are needed to calculate impacts, prepare and review the report. And again, if this work is being undertaken by a consultant team, submit it to environmental services so that we're able to do our review and we can get the report over to agencies. And then agency review and concurrences will occur, and their concurrences are needed for the environmental process to continue. So again, looking at it on a process flow, just another way to look at how these activities are spread out. Our leading indicator is receiving plans. following the A3M with our goal of completing technical studies. So when those hot button changes either arrive late, look at the work we've already undertaken that needs to be revisited, and with agencies receiving reports late, that is going to jeopardize holding the PFPR. And efforts made during A3M, they may not be fully successful in avoiding and minimizing, and so there may be a consultation required that needs more time than what's been allotted in the schedule. But again, this doesn't happen very often. Formal Section 7 under the Endangered Species Act, an individual Section 4F evaluation, perhaps unanticipated public controversy, and any consultation with NOAA fisheries, whether that's essential fish habitat or Section 7. So again, it's important to communicate these schedule implications to the attention of the PM, the environmental analyst, the rest of the team. And as with resource identification results, it's important to think about contract scope implications if the work is being done by a consultant. Have they scoped for an individual Section 4F or formal Section 7? Well, we're looking back at Appendix O again and preliminary design activities. NEPA document can get underway even before tech studies are complete. Our goal is to have the NEPA document approved soon after the preliminary field plan review for our goal to certify right of way. And so for illustrative purposes, I'm going to be talking about advancing a categorical exclusion that has to go to federal highway, knowing that many of our categorical exclusions, which is the primary federal document we do, can be approved internally under the programmatic. But for the discussion today, I'm going to be talking about a categorical exclusion going to federal highway. And as I indicated, preparation can get underway before we've received all of our agency concurrences. And so early on, the environmental analyst preparing this document can be thinking about what's in the technical studies, get that preparation underway, prepare an environmental commitments table and circulate it for review and approvals, and begin review of the CE so that it can then be in review here for a quality assurance review so that it can get to federal highway and allow them time to review and approve the document. So parsing this out on a process flow and spreading out these activities over this time frame. Again, that CE can be prepared while technical studies are wrapping up to ultimately achieve our goal of environmental approval. And so again, hot button changes at PFPR is going to cause great delay. It's going to, if that document gets to federal highway late, we've now intruded into their time, which of course is going to delay right-of-way authorization. And we still have one more task for if right-of-way funds are federally using federal dollars, we have to do a right-of-way authorization or certification for that authorization. And there isn't much time between when the document is scheduled for approval and when that certification needs to be done. So before that document is approved, we need to be looking at those right-of-way plans. And then that will allow us to certify quickly after the document is approved. And so how that looks on our process flow, once PFPR comments have been addressed, the NEPA document is approved and right-of-way plans are circulated, we are ready to certify. So if those right-of-way plans show changes and that NEPA document misses its scheduled completion date, our certification is delayed, which jeopardizes that authorization. And so again, this is for federal right-of-way funds. And then moving back to Appendix O for final design activities, we need those lockdown plans to prepare permit and variance applications so that we can certify on time. And as you can see, we're not given much time between the scheduled lockdown and the environmental cert. And I just want to note that this 27 weeks here is the 38-week lockdown minus the 11-week certification. So that's a 27-week window if we have an individual permit, and similarly for general 404 permits and buffer variances, the 20 weeks here is 31 weeks minus the 11-week on-time cert, giving us a 20-week window. So prior to lockdown, we have to have received any hot button changes so we can evaluate what types of updated studies are needed. And once we have those plans, we are able to prepare certifications and prepare applications by calculating the impacts, getting those applications into review, and getting them off to the agencies so that they have adequate time to do their review, their public notice. Both the Corps of Engineers and the Environmental Protection Division have public notice requirements. And so those are times that are just absolutely needed. And then they have to do their authorization for signature and get that circulated. And we will be purchasing mitigation at this time. And so looking at this again on a timeline, once we receive those lockdown plans, we're underway on a major activity needed to certify for lead. And so when those lockdown plans show changes or changes are made after lockdown are circulated, we're having to recalculate, rewrite, re-review all of those things. And when those applications go to the agencies late, our late certification is going to jeopardize the lead. And as with the time frame between lockdown and certifications, there isn't much time between the final field plan review and the environmental certification. It's just 13 weeks between an FFPR, assuming it's held around the 24-week prior to let date, and our 11-week cert. That gives us a 13-week window. So prior to FFPR, we are going to be looking at those plans so we can again evaluate studies, if studies are needed, and if we have not received changes prior to FFPR, we're making major changes. So the goal here is to just have any minor changes that are covered in minor memos, because as you can see from this after field plan list of activities, if we have to do any addendums and redo any agency reviews and a NEPA reevaluation, there isn't much time to get all of that done. And so looking at this on our process review for our certifications, again, it's an 11-week certification date. And so if we get hot button changes at FFPR, that gives us a very late start to updating studies, which is going to jeopardize the lead. And so you'll notice here, I've said 7 weeks, and 7 weeks is the latest we can certify. The on time is at 11 weeks, but there is an option to go to 7 weeks. We don't like to do it. It doesn't look good on our scorecards. And so I'm just going to move on a little bit to talk about late versus on time versus conditional certifications. It's considered a miss if we are late or have to do a conditional cert. But we can scramble to wrap things up until 7 weeks. But if we're not ready by then, we have to do a conditional certification to hold the lead. But do note that studies must be updated and improved reevaluation must be in hand before we can conditionally certify. But if we can have everything in hand by 7 weeks, a late cert is preferred over a conditional cert because the conditional cert has a few additional touches, permissions to complete it, and then a second certification to release conditions. And so looking at conditional certs for federal versus state, both need updated studies. Only a federally funded conditional cert needs a reevaluation. Both can have a permit variance or mitigation outstanding. And we have to know when everything will be in hand and whether or not a deferral is needed. And then I'm just going to finish out this morning to talk about what the LET actually is. As the previous timeline shown, the department sends out a notice to contractors 4 weeks prior to the letting to invite them to submit bids. And these bids are accepted up until 11 a.m. the day of the let. And that letting is the opening of the bids. And the department may have opted to withdraw the project from the let, and this would occur after the notice to contractors is published, but before bids are opened. We may reject the bids. Perhaps our estimates are out of line with the proposed costs. Maybe there's an issue with the plans. Hopefully we have awarded we're able to award to the lowest responsible bidder. But in addition to withdrawing, rejecting, or awarding, we may also defer the award, and this factors into our conditional certifications. Standard deferral is 50 days. If we don't believe we can have everything in hand within 50 days following the let, we'll need to request a special provision be added to extend that deferral period. And while that is during that deferral period, we will be getting all of any outstanding permits and variances, purchasing any mitigation, and completing any other commitments to release those conditions. And with that, thank you for your attention, and we'll go back to Amber Phillips.
All right, so I'm going to talk about how to set and juggle our workload priorities. So, Gail just gave you a good indication of all the steps that we need to take to get things complete. But that doesn't mean that each staff member has an infinite amount of time. So they'll need to know what projects do they need to review or work on first. In order to do that, you have to have that understanding that Gail just walked us through of when we have to complete things. So again, we said the schedule starts out on time. So we're going to look at baseline dates versus of course, our office review policy and deadlines, the role of team meetings and the status of other disciplines, baseline versus management let dates, and what is the target. So first steps, you're going to have a workload, what's expected to be completed, know what needs to be completed each month, when the baseline, let and right away dates, and do you need to contact anyone for more information? So it's really good, especially if you're submitting something and you're a consultant and something is behind or needs something special, make sure that that is communicated so that that can be taken into consideration when staff members are ultimately choosing what item to review first. Right? We have a ton of projects, which that's a very good thing. We like to have and work on and be able to provide all the projects that we are able to provide to the citizens of Georgia. But, right, we don't have enough time. So what am I looking at? Our top priorities, we want to make sure that we meet and make the let status. Why do we want to make sure we're meeting the let? Is because each month we have to spend and balance a certain amount of money, or we could end up losing that money. So when we're taking something and looking at our priorities, we want to especially take into account funding. And of course, we want to look at, is there anything under construction? Again, those things would be a priority. Under construction, you have delays that can result in financial issues or problems. So we want to look at those things right away so that we're not missing those. All right, so it gets a little bit confusing after that. Baseline in general is always what we want to work on. But right, again, here's the cartoon this is our top priority, and then some people start asking questions, what about this, what about that? So question, is it more important than fiscal year? Well, if a project is behind schedule and we need to make fiscal year right-of-way authorization, projects, again, like letting that must spend money, we need to make that a priority. So we want to be on time for our right-of-way authorizations. In general, that would, of course, be the best thing. But if we're going to miss it, we need to make the funding. So here is just an example of the pre-construction status report. And here it showed you that the management right-of-way date was July of 2020. And the right-of-way funds over here highlighted in the box were moved to, or in FY21, because that was July, was 21. We actually didn't make this project in July. So the goal is now to be able to authorize these right-of-way funds by the end of the fiscal year. So again, we don't want to miss our fiscal year for when we have funding. So how do I know when I need to prioritize to make the federal risk, the right-of-way fiscal year? It is a priority to, again, recover the fiscal, not a priority over baseline. However, if project is at the end of the fiscal year, there is no time to recover that baseline. So know when your baseline is. If you have a baseline date and it's in May, you're going to have to make that. There's no time to recover the fiscal year. A CE project, we need special studies complete in around February, March, and this is still going to be tight, these dates that I'm giving you, to make the end of the fiscal year. And that's for projects without 4F. If 4F is needed, we really need those studies completed by September. These represent, of course, like I said, these are very tight time frames, so these aren't really things that can be missed. So make sure that if you're close to these timelines, you're really communicating with the team, letting them know what the goal is that we're trying to make. For EA project, studies need to be complete around the October timeframe. And if it has 4F, make sure it's completed by August to make the fiscal year. For projects behind schedule, again, coordination is key. We want to make sure that we're discussing it, we're letting people know. Is it feasible for PCRF? It might not be. You might need to make sure you really push it. Maybe there are other issues outstanding and the project isn't going to make it even if we made it. So make sure that once you get behind schedule, you're really communicating with your PM. Your PM will be able to tell you what you need to do. So what I know so far, where does the review policy come in, right? Things get a little confusing. So here's just the kind of the outline, right? Our top priority that I mentioned, projects in let status and under construction. Next, you want to determine if your project is at risk for missing the fiscal right-of-way year. Baseline, of course, is always very important. We need to stay on baseline. Things will be much less complicated if we could stay on baseline. And we wouldn't have to worry about how to prioritize things. But again, our next priority, we want to make sure we're working on projects that are behind baseline. We don't want to ignore these, or they will become projects at risk for missing the right-of-way and let status fiscal year. And we want to make sure that our NEBA comments are up to date so that everyone on the team knows if we're able to recover something, or if we can't recover something, again, we need to alert management. It's always the goal to complete by the review policy. However, right, we talked about heavy workloads. The most important thing if you have to make a choice, is let fiscal year right away and baseline. So baseline versus the management. So we all know sometimes the schedule, the baseline schedule doesn't always match the management schedule. If your date, as an example, is showing up in 2021, but the management right away is showing 2030, is it important that you work towards this baseline? Well, make sure you discuss this with at your team meetings and reach out, because each project will be a little bit different. There may be a good reason for this difference. There could be a contract that's about to expire. It could be that the funding is expected to be found and it will move up, and the pre-construction status report hasn't yet been updated. In general, program delivery will be working towards, if it's a shelf project, and we'll talk about shelf projects later in this presentation, they'll want us to work towards that baseline date. So just knowing some of those reasons will help you and our staff prioritize projects. In general, again, always work to make the baseline. That will make things clearer. However, if funding is removed from a project, it could move to long range with a schedule stoppage. So again, determine if we need to actually work on the project to get to a good stopping place for the future, or if we should stop at that point in time. What do I do when most projects are behind baseline, but we are not receiving a PCRF to change the schedule baseline? How do we track these? Well, that's a good question, and we have things that we're working on, and Amber Maddox will be presenting on what we're working on there in a minute. So recovery status in a little bit more details. If tech studies are behind baseline and you're trying to determine what should be worked on, and if you can recover that date, what does NEPA need to get back on schedule? So for a CE, there's not as much time to get back on track with the schedule. The NEPA document should be in review within 30 days of tech studies complete. However, NEPA can, as Gail pointed out, we can start writing the document. Sometimes we can start a review early in the process with draft findings. Just make sure that that's communicated to the reviewer, which means when absolutely necessary on a CE project, we could recover the baseline even if tech studies are about 60 days behind schedule. Anything more than that's really going to make it very difficult on a CE project. An EA schedule, under the new federal guidance, the EA schedule will be updated. We will have a 12-month to obtain this, and I'm presenting at the Transportation Summit on this, so you'll hear more about it if you're attending that. So with that 12-month schedule, there's not going to be, we're not going to be able to miss once tech studies are done. However, this change will allow for concurrence from agencies to be completed in the 12-month time clock, providing extra time with completion of the AOE reports if needed. So we can, once we identify that 12-month time, we should hopefully be able to get everything complete at that time by ensuring that we have concurrences for everything except for cultural resource, but we have worked with our agencies prior to starting our 12-month time clock. And just for general, at the end of the fiscal year for right-of-way, we actually get a list of projects that are in the fiscal year. I usually get that around April from program delivery, and we identify what projects we will make. We provide our feedback to right-of-way because they need to authorize funds. We should strive to have our NEPA document or reevals completed by the end of May. This means specialists should be complete in early April at the latest. And again, that if they're done in early April, that should give Federal Highway about a little bit short of time, but hopefully these are minor updates and reevals at that point in time that we can make the end of May. For projects that we absolutely need through the end of June to complete, we can let right away know, and they can process the paperwork in order to authorize that. But we need to confirm that with them. And once we say that we're going to make something at the end of June, we actually must make that date, because right away is working and already pushing the funding button that they have to push in early June. So make sure that when you have a project that we're trying to recover the right-of-way year, or that is at the end of the right-of-way year, that we're striving for completion for May. And with that, I will turn it over to Amber Maddox.
Okay, so I'll just be talking briefly about recovering the schedule once the baseline schedule is derailed. So just a brief overview of what I'll be talking about. I'll get a little bit into why we've developed this new recovery schedule process, how the process will be initiated, and then what the process is anticipated to look like, sort of the workflow, how SMEs can prepare for this process, and then just a few final considerations when working through this process. And lastly, just a few things to keep in mind before I jump into it. The recovery schedule process is still in development, so we expect to roll out an in-depth training that's expected July of 2021. So there will be a deeper training on this specific effort before it's actually rolled out. Also, if you have questions that come up later regarding this effort, feel free to contact Christina Schmidt, Liza Wagon, or myself on any questions regarding this. So just to get into a little bit about why we've developed this process, we want to allow input from all project team members. In the past, PMs would sort of work solely with consultants to come up with, we would find not so realistic recovery schedules. And those would also include expedited internal reviews. So that wouldn't, of course, that didn't include the internal folks with coming up with these schedules. So we want to allow for input from all sides of the project team. Also, team awareness of new targets. We want folks to be aware of the new target dates. In the past, we would get an email and it would sit in someone's inbox. So everyone was not aware of the new target dates. Also, ease of access for all project team members. We will be using SharePoint as sort of a landing spot for this information. That way, all project team members will have access to developed recovery schedules at any point. And this also will make for more efficient tracking. With use of SharePoint, we'll be able to pull these schedules at any point to see, what we're actually making or missing as far as the new target dates. And then lastly, a standardized process for project managers. We wanted to give PMs a formalized standard way of creating and maintaining these recovery schedules. So when to initiate recovery? For this effort, we will be using A3M as a checkpoint to determine which projects will undergo this effort and which ones will not. So projects that can proceed to A3M at risk or are just good to go to A3M will not undergo this effort. Projects that cannot proceed to A3M will use this effort. Again, projects that can go at risk will also not use this effort. I know that's a little confusing, but even if the project can go to A3M at risk, it will not undergo this effort. So just to get into briefly what the workflow is expected to look like I mentioned previously, A3M will be the checkpoint for determining which projects will undergo this process and which ones will not. And that determination will be made by our EPMs in coordination with our scheduling group. So once it's determined that a project cannot go to A3M, that's when the EPM will notify the PM, and then the PM will set up the actual recovery meeting. So the PM will be notified that, the project cannot go to 8:3M. The PM will also be provided with the list of attendees. Also, they will be provided with instructions and sort of checklist guidance for attendees who will be attending the meeting. Once the meeting is scheduled, attendees, like I mentioned before, the PM will have the list of attendees that need to be at the meeting, and you will get guidance and instructions on how to properly prepare for that meeting. And then at the actual meeting, there will be a digital form used, and the PM will use that form to sort of walk the group through a series of questions to foster conversation so that basically the group can come up with the new target dates, and then things like efforts to expedite and ultimately the recovery point for the schedule will also be recorded in that digital form. And then once the PM is done filling that form out, they will submit that form and it will be verified internally through our scheduling group, and it will be populated into SharePoint for ease of access for all project team members. And I'd like to mention also that this effort for now is only intended for projects leading up to right of way. So at this time, it's not intended for project schedules that are leading up to just leading up to right of way, and also intended for only new projects. Just a little bit about how SMEs can prepare for the recovery meeting. So preparation would include knowing your current status and being able to forecast for key deliverables and milestones. And those deliverables would include your resource ID and your tech studies, when you would complete your field surveys, AOEs or survey report, and then of course any GDOT consultant or agency reviews. And then for NEPA, that would include forecasting for public involvement, if applicable, as well as the NEPA document. Also in that checklist guidance, you'll have all of this information, and we'll want you to think about ways you might be able to expedite any of these items, or also think about schedule risks, things that may preclude us from expediting any of this, because all of that information will be recorded in the form during the meeting as well. And then just a few final considerations to keep in mind when you're going through this process. You want to keep in mind the funding years. If the funding year is way out, like Amber Phillips said before, should we be working towards this, recovering the baseline schedule? You want to keep that in mind. Also keep in mind agency, the feasibility of expedited agency reviews. We know it's a reality sometimes that agency expedited reviews aren't always an option. So you want to keep that in mind as well. And then sometimes we know that baseline schedule PCRFs are, sometimes needed. So you want to keep that in mind too. If the baseline schedule is just completely not recoverable, keep in mind whether a PCRF may be needed. And later in this presentation, someone will get into a little bit more about PCRFs. Oh yeah, one thing that I wanted to also mention is that the recovery meeting is not intended to be a new meeting. We've already spoken with OPD and they're on board with this effort. It's intended to take the place of a routine project monthly meeting. So it should not add to your, calendar of meetings that you already have. And at this time, I will pass it over to Jim.
Good morning. Today I'm going to talk about what happens when the schedule goes off the tracks. As everyone knows, we start with a P6 schedule that has baseline dates that we hope we'll meet. Sometimes we get off track, and sometimes we'll do a recovery schedule like Amber just discussed to try to get back on track. But there are always those projects that just go completely off the tracks, and this can happen for a number of reasons. There's environmental reasons such as individual 4F, formal Section 7, public controversy, complex resources and agency coordination. And a lot of times when we encounter those, it is impossible to recover that baseline schedule. There's also other reasons that happen outside of environmental, such as procurement delays, Sometimes local projects experience delays. Sometimes projects run out of funding. And it can be a combination of all those factors. Sometimes it's death by a million cuts, where there's a little delay here with this, a little delay here with that. And the schedule, the baseline schedule just can't be recovered. And sometimes you may already be working on a recovery schedule, hoping to recover that baseline, and something happens as you're working through that that is unforeseen, and again, the baseline is unrecoverable. So what do we do? If it's part of your, if the reason is part of your discipline, you obviously want to alert the project team as soon as possible. Hopefully you're having monthly team meetings. If not, you definitely want to alert the PM and the rest of the project team about what's happening, and the PM will then start the PCRF process. And a PCRF is a project change request form. And this is a formal process that resets the project baseline. And this is submitted by the PM. So when can we do a PCRF? Well, there's different rules depending on where we are in the project schedule. During concept, we can request a PCRF if we are already more than 12 months behind baseline. We can also request a PCRF if we're less than 12 months behind baseline but can't recover the fiscal year money. During preliminary plans, the 12-month rule is also in play if we're greater than 12 months behind. Baseline can also be changed with a simplified PCRF if right-of-way acquisition is critical path after right-of-way authorization. During final plans, the 12-month rule is also in play, although upper management would like to see that has been greater than 12 months behind for more than 3 months. For delays less than 12 months, the let date can be shifted at let status with the approval of the chief engineer and the director of engineering. In those instances, the baseline is not adjusted. The target date is just shifted out as needed, and the team will be following the letting schedule, not the baseline. So again, PCRFs are filled out by the PM and submitted to the Office of Program Control. The PCRF itself is a form, and it describes the timeline for, what happened, how did we get here, why do we need a PCRF? And it identifies the critical path to the next authorization. And it also includes a table that describes the current baseline dates, proposed dates, and the difference between the two, the net change. And this table is usually provided by the EPMs and OES to the subject matter experts to review to see if, in fact, the proposed dates can be met by their specialty. Again, this table will be submitted to the Office of Environmental Services, and the EPMs will coordinate with the subject matter experts to see if the proposed dates in the PCRF will be adequate for them finishing their studies. The PCRF process goes all the way up to chief engineer. So lots of eyes on it. Sometimes they do get denied, but it's not very common. If it does get denied, it's usually getting pushed back for more information so that they can have a more informed review of the PCRF. In 2020, we had, there were 187 approved PCRFs. And it's maybe hard to see, but environmental not approved is one of the reasons. But that was only 12 of the 187, so roughly 7%. And now I'm going to pass it over to Doug, who will talk about the shelf.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about the shelf. I think probably everyone's encountered it, and the proverbial shelf is fairly common in the project delivery process. It's not unique to environmental. Okay, so the shelf is a designation for a project that has advanced as far as feasible while awaiting funding for the next phase. Getting some background noise on, if everyone could mute, thank you. A designation for a project that has advanced as far as feasible while awaiting funding for its next phase. However, the project remains a priority to advance. If it wasn't a priority, instead of putting on the shelf, they would just strip the schedule and wait for it to be prioritized and give it a new schedule. It can be in a state where it's waiting for either right-of-way or construction funds. We have a shelf for both of those situations. And just to clear up a misconception, the shelf does not mean the project is shovel ready. We can't pull it off the shelf and let it next month, with rare exceptions on very minor projects. So why do we need a shelf? All of those environmental practitioners have probably encountered rework because of the shelf. So what is the benefit of it then? Well, in a word, it's flexibility for the department. Funding can get shifted. There can be grants, as this year happened with stimulus, COVID stimulus. There can be federal redistribution that we have to be ready for, redistribution of funds. A given project may hit a snag that puts it on, either deprioritizes it or delays the schedule, and we have to be ready to fill in for those. Amber mentioned we can lose funds if we don't spend them, so having something to fill in ensures that we don't get funds unused and lost. And again, with flexibility for lettings, it can help us move projects around to balance our lettings, which Eric talked about, balancing lettings. So we'll talk about the construction shelf first. Projects may be designated, prepare plans for shelf on the pre-construction status report. That's an indicator that construction funds are approved in a fiscal year beyond the fiscal year for construction authorization in the baseline schedule. A checklist of what's needed to put a project on the construction shelf. And there is some give and take with these. So these are not absolutes. These are general rules of what's needed. Permits, if construction funds are in a fiscal year within 24 months of the baseline let date, then we are expected to go ahead and get 404 permit and buffer variance. There is, again, flexibility with that. If it doesn't make sense to get a permit because the program is expiring, then we can let the PM know and they won't, it's not an absolute to get that permit. Right away, they have to have all parcels acquired and generally have certified that. There could be an outstanding commitment that prevents certification in rare cases, but that's generally the requirement. Utilities generally do not certify, they're not quite ready yet. We have to have corrected FFPR plans. Environmental, generally we don't certify. There could be some rare instances where we do if it's a short shelf stay and the project is not expected to change. And lastly, this one is required. Shelf approval form is a form that's signed all the way up to the chief engineer. It spells out what happens when the project comes off the shelf, what are some of the risks. It could be contracting, it could be getting time needed to get permits, or anything outstanding will be listed and the time needed. Take a quick look at a pre-construction status report. To see what a shelf project looks like, you're going to focus in on the upper right corner of the pre-construction status report where we have management dates and funding dates. I'm going to blow that up for a better view. In this case, we have the designation under who lets, prepare plans for shelf. That's the most obvious indicator, but you can also look at your let date. In this case, it's June 2023. So the end of the fiscal year 23 is our management let date. However, looking down below, construction funds are 2026. So we have in this case, we have a greater than 2-year delay between our project going on shelf and the funds. So in this case, we would not be expected to get permits. For the right-of-way shelf, similar definition: if funds are approved in a fiscal year beyond the fiscal year for right-of-way authorization that's in the schedule, the project will be designated as right-of-way plans on the shelf once right-of-way plans are approved. Now, this one is not quite as obvious looking at the pre-construction status report. You won't find prepare plans for shelf except maybe in the notes. What's needed? We need to have approved right-of-way plans, environmental, certified for right-of-way for federal funded projects. Of course, for state funded projects, a certification for right-of-way is not required. And as with construction shelf, the shelf approval form is the critical path, spelling out the risks and what's needed once it comes off the shelf. For the right-of-way shelf, there are no other certifications. Utilities does not have a cert for right-of-way in general. So this is environmental is the only cert from an engineering services standpoint that's needed. Take a look at a pre-construction status report for a right-of-way shelf project. All right, I'm going to zoom in on the upper right corner again. This one, take a look at the right-of-way date, August 2020, which is fiscal year 21, but the funding is fiscal year 22. That's a good situation where we have a fairly short shelf life, and hopefully our environmental studies do not expire during that time. But it will be about a year, and the funding is programmed in that 22 year, so that they'd be ready to go, start acquiring right of way as soon as July 1st, 2021 occurred. Removing a project from a shelf. The PM is notified by program control that funding has become available. And for the right-of-way shelf, the PM would submit a PCRF. A schedule is put back on the project. It would show up on the pre-construction status report, full with baseline dates. Generally, for the construction shelf, all they do is add a management let date. They do not go back and reconstruct the P6 schedule in most cases. So in those ones, we would have to really be tracking our final steps to let ourselves, because we wouldn't be able to rely on P6. And I'm going to show you one example of a shelf approval form, which I think is instructive in understanding how we document the commitments and the risks to the project once it goes on the shelf. This one, you see, it's from 2017, but the same form is in use today. The project is being prepared for the construction shelf. You can see FFPR was held. Comments were addressed, cost estimates updated. There's a spot for right-of-way, and they confirmed that all parcels were acquired, and they certified that right-of-way is complete. They also document that they have a special concern that one easement is only 10 years long. But really, we're interested in the environmental section here. It was a CE. It had a reeval in 2014. It does require permits. Now, notice this one has a nationwide permit, March 2017 expiration. Well, this project went on the shelf in later 2017, so that permit's already expired. The buffer variance also will expire 2 years after it goes on the shelf. So those are things that we'd have to kind of restart once it comes off the shelf. Now, environmental certified for right-of-way and did not certify for construction. That's typical. Utilities has a space. They're not certified. They rarely would be certified. Now, a mention of contracts, because obviously contracts could add time once it comes off the shelf if they need to initiate anything for design or environmental. In this case, it is not applicable as an in-house project. But below, you'll see outstanding issues that need to be resolved. It says environmental services needs to obtain a 4.4 permit and a stream buffer variance. Once the plans come off the shelf, OES will need 14 months to perform surveys and obtain outstanding items. So that's fairly normal that when a project that has the permits and variances comes off the shelf, we would need 14 to 18 months to get it ready to actually let. Just for completeness, I wanted to show you also the final part of that form, which is signatures from upper management up to the chief engineer. And with that, I'll turn it back to Gail.
We're in the home stretch and wanted to end this morning with a few takeaways. As Amber mentioned, schedule starts with a template, but projects aren't all alike. So that template is meant to be tailored to the project specifics. Delivering your activity affects how the entire team progresses. So be mindful of how your piece affects everyone else. Too many items in the inbox. You'll want to prioritize reviews based on the upcoming let date and fiscal right-of-way year. And as Amber Maddox mentioned, we have instituted a recovery schedule process when the project does not proceed on time. Communication is vital, especially when your activities are unrecoverable. We do have a project change request form, as was just talked about, Jim talked about, and in certain situations, a baseline can be changed. And as Doug just talked about, we do have a shelf of projects that, includes projects that are close to being ready if additional funding becomes available. And just a few strategies to remain on schedule. If you are a prime consultant that traditionally uses sub-consultants for some of the project team, you'll need to be mindful of when their activities start so that your notice to proceed to them is in keeping with when their activities need to get underway. We've had environmental deliverables arrive after their scheduled date because the sub didn't have NTP. Delivering per the baseline allows activities that follow to remain on schedule. As you've noted, hopefully, the time allotted for each of the environmental activities don't really accommodate third and fourth revisions. And so we'll want to be sure that any report or document put in has had a thorough review before submitting. And as we've said repeatedly, hot button changes made once we're underway always have the potential to delay delivery. And when the unanticipated happens, be sure to discuss schedule and contract scope implications. Before we wrap up, a quick plug for our revamped guidance material, which is a series of environmental guidebooks. They're posted online at this website. They're almost done. The last remaining one should be posted in the next couple of weeks or a couple of months, and included in the upcoming ones that should be posted by June or so is one specifically on baseline schedule presented in a guidebook. Looking at the Q&A, it appears that there seemed to be an issue with signing in, and I think everyone signed in anonymously. So please be sure before we wrap things up this morning to put your name and email address and your firm in the chat box. We do have a web page on recent trainings, and we will post our session there. And not everyone wants or needs PDHs or continuing education units. So please be sure to make that request to me. Some of you have already. I hope you all were paying attention while you were emailing me. Thanks to all of our presenters this morning. Eric, Amber Phillips, Amber Maddox, Jim and Doug, and of course, Brian, thank you always for all of your guidance and support. We always appreciate your work and helping us out on these sessions. And with that, Sandy, I think we are time for any questions that have come in.
Thank you, Gail. I think if y'all will look in the chat, the presenters have been answering questions as they have come in. So that leaves us only one remaining question. But before we get to that, I just wanted to point out for anyone who is looking for the PDH credits, I also put Gail's email address in the chat so you can contact her using that email address. So the question that still remains in our chat is, are shelf approval forms, and I guess I'll direct this to you, Doug, are shelf approval forms available to consultants to view?
Thanks, Sandy. Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that. I think, well, where I find them is on the Office of Program Control's SharePoint site, which I think consultants probably do not have access to. However, the PM should absolutely share them. If you're working on a project that goes to the shelf, they generally are going to ask for input from each office. So I think you get it from the PM anytime you have a shelf project. And I'm sorry if that's an incomplete answer. I don't know if there's a public place where you can find them on GDOT's website. I don't think so.
Thank you, Doug. The next question I'll pose to you, Gail. Which set of plans or series are needed when the plan receipt to technical studies complete, that 7-month timeline, are needed, and trying to identify which plans OES needs exactly and the level of completion it's needed roughly?
I don't have the complete list in front of me, but we recognize these are preliminary plans. And as I mentioned, we are working to figure out how to, specifically Section 20 plans are what we are working on, and at a preliminary stage for bridge projects. Certainly roadway plans, anything we know about utilities at that time is helpful. Again, for bridges, it's important to have some idea of construction access, but I can certainly develop a more complete response and we can post that.
Thank you, Gail. There are no additional questions in the chat right now, so please, if you have any questions, go ahead and put those in the chat. Take advantage of having these presenters be able to answer your questions directly. And as Gail has said, and Gail, correct me if I'm wrong, we're going to have both the recording and a PDF of the slides available on the training website.
Yes, absolutely. And we will also look through and certainly can post responses to both the shelf question and what plans are needed. Okay, any other questions, anything? We have one. When should a A3M meeting be conducted? During the concept phase or after preliminary design has started? And I'm not sure where exactly it fits on the slot on the timeline, but it is certainly as concept is wrapping up. And as preliminary design for us, for environmental, it is that transition between resource identification and technical studies are evaluating impacts. But I'm not sure exactly where that break point is.
Yeah, this is Amber. In the schedule, it falls in preliminary design.
Okay, thank you. And Appendix O, page 2, thank you, Anonymous, that does define which plan sets to include in each submission. Sandy, I'm seeing a few more questions.
Yes, so another question. I posed this to the group, not sure who will be able to answer this one, but when does environmental need box culvert construction information, such as face of box culvert cross-section, stream profile, or baffle elevations?
We need that information definitely for the Corps of Engineers when we're applying for the permit. They are requiring a lot of stream data and culvert data, especially if it's a perennial stream. And, you know, construction information will be important as we're assessing effects as to whether or not we're having to divert the channel and how that is going to work. I will look for the training website. And then Sam, I'm assuming this is Sam Woods. 2 things needed for A3M are resource ID complete and the first run of cross sections. Thank you, Sam.
And then for Amber, this is for you, Amber Phillips. Can you clarify what milestones will be occurring within the 12 months under the new federal guidance? Also, does this apply to all EAs and EISs?
Yeah, so the 12-month timeline, the things that we're going to need to complete prior to starting the 12-month time clock is we can go all the way to getting our least damaging alternatives. Federal Highway has said we can wrap up all studies except for we cannot initiate with SHPO under 106. So we can do everything except for our 106 coordination with SHPO and concurrence. So once we start our 12-month time clock, at the same time as we're submitting the draft, either EA or EIS to Federal Highway is when we will be submitting our AOEs for SHPO concurrence.
Thank you, Amber. And then Amber Maddox, I have a question for you. For the recovery schedule process, the hope is that will improve tracking in the future, but do you have any recommendations for easier ways for us to incorporate tracking them now?
As far as tracking recovery schedules now, we don't have a standard process for how folks are submitting them, but my only suggestion would be to place them within, the project files that we use. If we're using ProjectWise or somewhere that everyone can get to that project schedule.
Then another question, do the OES subject matter experts need to be included in all approved right-of-way plan revision distributions?
Amber Phillips, what's the tradition for our environmental analysts?
So I'm trying to make sure I understand the question. Usually, is that after we authorize right away? Or, because usually we authorize right away based on the final right away plans. So we wouldn't necessarily need all the iterations before then. But if this is after right away authorization, then we would get all the changes, as long as they're not hot button changes, at one time closer to the letting before lockdown. So I don't know if that completely answers.
And this is Eric. We're going to introduce some new guidance on right-of-way revisions after right-of-way authorization for people to follow. So be on the lookout for that here in the relatively near future.
Thank you, Amber, Eric, and Eric. One other question in the chat. When should at what time should the PCRAPI, the project change request, be submitted? At what time, just to clarify?
So when we need those, we need to know about hot button issues right away. So as soon as a hot button change occurs, there should be some sort of communication to that, and we want to cover those right away. If they're minor changes, then there's a point in the schedule leading towards let for when we can get all of the minor changes wrapped up. So we would just follow that P6 schedule.
Thank you, Amber. There's another question in the chat. It's if we can provide a link to the training website in the chat, that would be great. Or if not, would it be sent out by email afterward?
I posted something, and hopefully it is published. But if you just go to the department's website, dot.ga.gov, and search for recent training, it is in the Partner Smart portion. But if you do just put in recent training, it will take you. That'll be your first choice on your search. And right now, our August understanding baseline, that was multiple offices, is still there. A public involvement process training, and then also a transit sub-recipient workshop is posted. And I did want to address, there was a question about asking for agency expedited reviews that Doug has responded to in the chat, but I guess I just wanted to add that those should be the exception, not the rule, that there aren't unlimited agency staffers, and every time we ask for an expedited review, they're setting aside something else in their stack that then jeopardizes that one being late. And so we really want to make every effort to get things over to them with an adequate amount of review time, and judiciously ask for an expedited review when there's absolutely no other option.
Those are all the questions we have in the chat right now, and we certainly have time left if anyone has any other questions they'd like to post to the chat.
Well, hearing none, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sandy, for offering to moderate the chat box. And again, be sure we have your name and your email and your firm. And if you do want PDHs, that will need to be an email to me. I don't want to send out certificates to folks who may not need them. And so any closing remarks, Eric, Amber, Doug, Jim, Amber? Anything before we close?
Just make sure that we keep up our good communication. Communication will help us recover more than silence.
Just a point to remember for everybody that hot button issues, especially after lockdown, have to receive division director approval. So just don't forget that. It's sometimes perceived that it's only associated with waters of the U.S., but no, it's all hot button issues. And I want to say thank you for everybody who attended the training.